Good morning, thank you. I'm here to present some work that we're doing in the Hanner Lab in collaboration with several students and technicians, starting with some work that Kevin did, and then moving through on to some work that Stephen Rogers has done with the GenFish crew. So it was looking at assays and assay designs and digging into the literature and evaluating some of the assays that were available and realizing that not all assays are equal or not all assays are just going to be able to be poached from the literature and used in our current study systems. And so one thing we really looked at was that, when we're looking at designing the assays, we have the target and non-target that we're interested in designing the assays against and for, and then evaluating all of the data that comes with those publications and trying to pull out and find out, how well do these assays work. And what we found out was that there wasn't a lot of the published data available so that we could evaluate these assays, which caused us to question, how could we go about this in a better way? How could we look at this in a better way for the students coming into Bob's lab in particular, to set them up for a guideline to move through the literature if they're looking for an assay, or better yet, when they're designing an assay, how could they better do this and better approach the problem? And so we're really just concentrating on the before the testing and getting that conceptual assay understood and constructed before we would move on to the in vitro and the field validation to save a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of time specifically for the master students and things like that don't have the time. So obviously we want to look at the previous standards that are in place, so evaluating these assays based on the standards that are there for the eDNA validation and thinking about those MICE standards and all the standards that go in place with this. But we felt that maybe there was a little bit of a missing puzzle piece right before you look at the eDNA validation standards, where we really want to have some type of just example or pipeline for those people learning or trying to understand or trying to use assays that are available in the literature. So we want to design some kind of process where we have a decision tree or something that can go along hand in hand with eDNA validation scale. So in looking at this, we tried to come up with the most comprehensive but simplest pipeline possible for a decision tree or some kind of decision element to pipe into the eDNA validation. So taking a step back and aside for a second here, we would need to obtain the data in order to test these assays. So we're not talking about with this decision tree, we're not making decisions based on how we would obtain those data or the programs you would use to design your assays, because that's a whole nother can of worms. But this would just be with your chosen way of obtaining the data and with your chosen assay programs, how would you go about with the positive and negatives you're going to get as outputs from those data? So that's the arrow coming in on the top there. And so we can look at it in two different respects, the two different types of assays we might want to design. And so we can look at both of these assay types and find out those decisions as we move along that tree. And maybe we wouldn't need the more expensive probe base versus the less expensive. And so that's really important for people who like to pinch their pennies and make sure that we can get more students and more labs and more testing and more samples. And then we have our decisions. So for each of those steps, we eventually come down to our decisions. And so we have a number of decisions here. And mainly they're going to fall into three groups. So, or four groups, I guess. But it works, and we've got a great assay, and we can just move on. It works, and it might potentially be a regional assay where we could use it, but we have to use it with some caveats. And then, of course, it might not work because we could have potential for two different error types. Did it go? Yes. And then this would move into that eDNA validation scale, and we can pipe it right into the Thallinger et al. Work and make sure that we're using the existing guidelines that are really great, but just adding something to the front of it. And so in conclusion, we had five kind of things that we wanted to think about when we were doing this work. One, to make sure that the data that are coming into it are all published and understandable. So we didn't touch in the actual designing of the pipeline or the decision tree about how you obtain it, but it's essential to know how those people did obtain those data and how they did design the assays before we can start making any decisions at all. Include all available non-target and target in those data when you're trying to use the decision tree is important. Incorporate as many non-targets as possible and that are relevant. Incorporate mismatch types and not just mismatches. So just because there's a mismatch doesn't mean that it's as great as a mismatch as some other mismatches. And then reevaluate and validate the assay regularly when you want to use it. Because if you're going to use it, we might have more data available in our databases that have come to pass. So thank you.